It was an unremarkable evening in Morganville, the kind of quiet weekday that had locals heading home early to settle in. The liquor store on 5th and Jefferson, a small corner shop known for its simple selection, was one of the last places people passed through before winding down for the night. The bright, flickering sign was a beacon for tired folks in need of a quick stop. Inside, the faint sound of music from the radio played, and shelves lined the walls, stacked with bottles, snacks, and a few half-empty rows of cold drinks. DeAndre Cooper entered the store after a long day at the construction site. He was a big guy, strong from years of manual labor, with a calm demeanor and a quiet smile that his friends and family loved. Tonight, he was just trying to pick up a cold beer and maybe something for his wife, Vanessa, who had asked him to grab a bottle of wine to go with the meal she'd been planning. He knew he'd be in and out of the store in 5 minutes tops, ready to head home and settle in with his family. As DeAndre walked down the aisle toward the wine section, he noticed a few others milling about, but no one seemed to pay him any mind. He grabbed a bottle of Vanessa's favorite red wine and a six-pack of his own, feeling the weight of the long day lifting a bit. Outside, Officer Trent Hayes sat in his squad car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Hayes had been patrolling Morganville for nearly a decade, and to him, it felt like the town had changed, and not for the better. He remembered when Morganville was quieter, more respectable, as he often muttered to himself. In recent years, though, he felt like he saw more and more people up to no good. The influx of newcomers seemed to annoy him, a creeping frustration that had turned into bitterness over time. Hayes wasn't responding to a call when he noticed DeAndre entering the liquor store. He hadn't seen the man do anything suspicious, but there was something about DeAndre that caught his eye. Something in Hayes's mind started building, a quiet, simmering judgment he couldn't shake. He saw DeAndre's size, his build, and the way he moved, and it triggered something Hayes didn't even fully understand in himself. He parked his car and decided to keep an eye on the man, even if he couldn't explain why he felt the need. Inside, DeAndre made his way to the counter. He greeted the cashier, a friendly older man who had been working there for years and knew nearly every customer by name. As DeAndre placed his items on the counter, he took out his wallet to pay. His fingers fumbled as he sorted through his cash, and he could feel the day's exhaustion weighing on him. But a moment later, he had what he needed and handed the bills over. Just as DeAndre was thanking the cashier and putting his items in a bag, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned to see Officer Hayes walking into the store, his face expressionless, but his eyes sharp and direct. "Evening, sir," Hayes said, his voice flat, his tone carrying an air of subtle authority. His gaze lingered a little too long, making DeAndre uncomfortable. "Evening," DeAndre replied, nodding politely but keeping his distance. He didn't know why the officer was here, or why he seemed so focused on him, but he reminded himself to stay calm and respectful. Hayes didn't move from his spot near the door, arms crossed over his chest. "Everything all right here?" he asked, directing his question more toward the cashier than to DeAndre. The cashier looked puzzled. "Yes, officer, everything's fine. Just helping a customer." But Hayes didn't seem satisfied. His eyes were still locked onto DeAndre, scanning him up and down as if searching for something out of place. "Can I help you with something, officer?" DeAndre asked finally, his tone careful and measured. He wasn't about to provoke anyone, but he also didn't understand why he was being watched. Hayes cocked his head slightly, the faintest hint of a smirk crossing his face. "Just doing my job, making sure everything's all right," he replied, though his gaze didn't waver. "You're out kind of late tonight, aren't you?" DeAndre felt the tension rise, but he kept his voice steady. Just picking up a few things for my wife. Long day at work, you know. The officer said nothing for a moment, just a prolonged silence that seemed to stretch longer than necessary. Finally, he nodded, though there was something hard and unreadable in his expression. "All right then," he said, stepping aside as if allowing DeAndre to pass, though he didn't move far. DeAndre took his bag, nodded at the cashier, and started to leave, though he could still feel Hayes's eyes on him. As he walked past, he could feel the officer's presence close, an uncomfortable shadow following him to the door. It felt heavy, the kind of weight that sits in your chest and tells you that something is wrong, even if you don't know exactly what. Outside, the air was cooler, but DeAndre didn't feel relief. He glanced over his shoulder to see Hayes still standing by the door, watching him as he walked toward his car. A strange unease settled in DeAndre's stomach, something he couldn't shake. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he knew all too well what it felt like to be watched, to be suspected, for no reason other than the color of his skin. It was a feeling he'd experienced before, but this time it felt different, more direct. As DeAndre started his car and pulled out of the parking lot, he couldn't help but notice the police car, parked a few spaces away, still there, still watching. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that he was just being cautious, that the officer had no reason to bother him further. But the feeling lingered, heavy and thick, as he drove away into the night, wondering if he'd left that watchful gaze behind, or if it was just the beginning of something that would follow him much further than he could imagine. DeAndre's heart was still racing as he drove home, trying to shake the feeling of being singled out for no reason. As he reached the stop sign at the next intersection, headlights flared up in his rearview mirror. He glanced up and instantly recognized the police cruiser following close behind. Officer Hayes was back. DeAndre sighed, gripping the wheel tightly. He hadn't done anything wrong. All he had were groceries and a quiet night at home planned, but the officer's car, tailing him in the empty streets, made him feel like he was being hunted. He'd been through this kind of situation before, and he knew the drill. Keep calm, be respectful, don't make sudden movements. But tonight, something about Hayes's unrelenting gaze had rattled him, bringing back memories he'd worked hard to put behind him. The cruiser's lights flashed on suddenly, red and blue, casting an eerie glow on the empty road. DeAndre pulled over immediately, the familiar surge of dread washing over him. He took a deep breath and waited, hands visible on the wheel as he'd been taught, hoping the officer would simply explain and let him go. Officer Hayes approached, his footsteps heavy and slow, each step deliberate. He rapped on the driver's side window, and DeAndre lowered it, keeping his face neutral. "Evening again, officer," DeAndre said, forcing a polite nod. "License and registration," Hayes said curtly, his voice void of any hint of courtesy. "Sure thing," DeAndre replied, moving cautiously to retrieve his documents from the glove compartment. He knew Hayes's eyes were on his every movement, watching for any excuse, no matter how small. As he handed over his license and registration, Hayes took them without a word, scanning them while keeping his eyes on DeAndre. "What's the problem, officer? Did I do something wrong?" DeAndre asked after a moment, trying to keep his voice steady. Hayes's expression hardened. "I saw you leaving the liquor store earlier. Thought I saw you put something in your pocket. You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" DeAndre's stomach dropped. He knew he hadn't taken anything, hadn't done anything to warrant suspicion. He was wearing only a light jacket with no deep pockets, just his wallet and keys. But there was something unnerving in Hayes's tone, as if he'd already decided what he wanted to see. "Officer, I can assure you, I didn't take anything," DeAndre said, his voice growing firm. "I paid for my items and have the receipt right here." Hayes didn't react to the explanation, just continued staring him down, eyes narrow. "Out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Reluctantly, DeAndre stepped out, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. As he stood by the side of the road, he noticed Hayes's hand hovering near his sidearm, a sight that made his pulse quicken. Hayes stepped closer, inspecting DeAndre as if he were sizing up an enemy. Without a word, he instructed DeAndre to turn around and place his hands on the car. The street was empty, and the silence felt oppressive. DeAndre did as he was told, his mind racing. He felt the officer's hands patting him down roughly, each movement meant to assert power. "Officer, I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong," DeAndre said, his voice breaking slightly under the weight of the humiliation and fear building in his chest. But Hayes didn't respond. Instead, he gripped DeAndre's arm, forcing it behind his back. The sudden pressure sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder, and he winced, a sharp intake of breath escaping as Hayes tightened his grip. "Stop resisting," Hayes barked. "I'm not resisting," DeAndre managed, his voice panicked now. He felt the cold, hard steel of cuffs snapping around his wrists, the bite of metal sharp against his skin. Hayes turned him roughly, his face inches from DeAndre's, eyes filled with a cold, steely anger. "You people think you can do whatever you want. Not in my town." Those words hit DeAndre harder than the cuffs digging into his wrists. It was a sentiment he'd heard echoed throughout his life, a reminder of the barrier that always seemed to exist between him and people like Officer Hayes. This wasn't about any crime. This was about power, control, and a festering resentment that had found a target. DeAndre tried to breathe, tried to keep himself calm. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hayes smirked, glancing around as if making sure no one else was watching. "I don't care what you think you did or didn't do. All I know is you look suspicious, and that's enough for me." He felt a sudden push as Hayes forced him to the ground, the rough asphalt scraping against his knees. The humiliation burned even deeper than the pain, and DeAndre looked up, his vision blurring with frustration, helplessness, and an anger he couldn't express. "Get comfortable down there, Cooper," Hayes sneered, walking back to his car. "I'm calling for backup. Let's see what else you've got hiding." As DeAndre knelt on the ground, the cold night air pressing down on him, the world felt smaller and darker. He could hear the faint sound of Hayes's radio crackling, words exchanged that only deepened his sense of isolation. The street remained empty, not a soul in sight. It felt like the world had abandoned him, leaving him alone in the darkness with a man whose mind was already made up. The minutes dragged by, each one intensifying the helplessness gnawing at his insides. He tried not to think about what this would mean for Vanessa, for his job, for his family. He thought of his son, Marcus, who looked up to him, who believed in justice and fairness because DeAndre had always taught him to trust the good in people. And here he was, powerless, caught in a nightmare he couldn't explain and couldn't wake up from. As Hayes returned, the officer's face was a mask of smug satisfaction, as if he'd accomplished something great. He roughly hauled DeAndre back to his feet, ignoring the scrape of blood on his hands from the asphalt. "Looks like you're coming with me tonight, Cooper," Hayes said, grinning as he led DeAndre toward the cruiser. We'll get this all sorted out at the station. I'm sure we'll find a reason to keep you around for a while." DeAndre didn't respond. His mind was numb, his spirit momentarily crushed. All he could do was follow, the flashing lights washing over him as he climbed into the back of the police car, the metal cage separating him from any hope of understanding, any sense of humanity. All he could think about was what would come next, how he'd have to explain the unexplainable, how he'd have to tell his family that he'd been taken in. For nothing. At the police station, DeAndre felt an intense cold settle into his bones, despite the warmth of the building. Officer Hayes had him sit on a hard metal bench in the corner, the cuffs still biting into his wrists. The station was dimly lit and quiet. Only a few officers milled around, typing reports or chatting in low voices. No one met his gaze. DeAndre's mind churned, racing through a list of people he might call, how he would explain this, how his family would react. He didn't have to wait long. Hayes returned, carrying a small stack of papers, his expression as smug as before. He motioned for DeAndre to follow him to an interview room. The space was plain, with a table, 2 chairs, and a fluorescent light that cast a harsh glow. DeAndre sat, waiting, while Hayes leaned back against the wall, flipping through his paperwork as if savoring the moment. "All right, Mr. Cooper," Hayes began, a condescending drawl to his voice. "Since you are here, let's get a few things straight. You were seen at that liquor store, acting suspiciously. I thought I saw you take something. Then, you resisted arrest when I tried to conduct a lawful search." DeAndre's jaw clenched, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "Officer, with all due respect, I didn't do any of that. I bought my things, I paid with cash, and I have the receipt. I didn't resist. I was only confused by your request to step out of the car." Hayes raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Is that right?" He flipped through his papers, as if looking for something incriminating. "You know, I'm pretty sure I saw something suspicious on you back there. Could have been drugs, maybe a weapon, and your attitude didn't help." The accusation hung in the air, and DeAndre felt a wave of dread. The absurdity of it was staggering. He didn't use drugs, he didn't carry weapons. He was just a man, heading home after work, but he could see the way Hayes's gaze narrowed, a twisted satisfaction in his eyes. This was a game to him, one that DeAndre knew all too well could end with his freedom taken away. "Look," DeAndre said, a pleading tone slipping into his voice, "I have no record, no history with drugs, no weapons on me. You've searched me. You know there's nothing. I don't understand what's going on here." Hayes shrugged, leaning back with a casual air. "Maybe you're telling the truth, maybe not. But as far as I'm concerned, I had every reason to believe you were up to something. People don't just get agitated for no reason, you know. We'll get some backup to verify your story." With that, Hayes exited, leaving DeAndre alone, his heart pounding as the seconds ticked by. He thought of calling Vanessa, but the thought of explaining this humiliation, of worrying her, made his stomach turn. She'd want to rush down, want to be there with him, but what could she do against an officer determined to twist the truth? Minutes later, another officer entered the room. He was older, his face lined with years on the job. He glanced at DeAndre, then took the seat across from him, his expression neutral but not unkind. He introduced himself as Sergeant Bell and began with a few basic questions, his voice calm, almost understanding. "Mr. Cooper," he began, "I'd like you to tell me in your own words what happened tonight." DeAndre felt a strange sense of relief at the officer's approach. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and explained everything. From the moment he walked into the liquor store to the instant Hayes had forced him out of his car. He described the feeling of being watched, the unwarranted stop, the forceful pat-down, the groundless accusations. When he finished, Sergeant Bell nodded slowly, jotting a few notes. "You say you have the receipt?" "Yes," DeAndre replied, trying not to let his desperation show. "It's in my wallet." Bell stood, motioning for DeAndre to stay put as he stepped out of the room. DeAndre closed his eyes, exhaustion settling into his bones. Every second felt like a weight bearing down on him, every silent moment making him feel smaller, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to erase his truth. Finally, Bell returned with the receipt in hand, confirming it with a nod. "This does check out," he said, his voice neutral, but DeAndre noticed the glint of recognition in his eyes. "I'll be speaking with Officer Hayes." The sergeant left, and DeAndre waited, his chest tightening with each passing minute. Eventually, Hayes returned, his face flushed with barely concealed irritation. "Well, Mr. Cooper," Hayes said, voice dripping with a forced politeness, "it seems we're releasing you. I'll be letting you off with a warning this time, just for being uncooperative." The words stung, an accusation veiled in condescension, as though DeAndre had somehow deserved this entire ordeal. He felt a bitter taste rising, a mixture of humiliation and anger he struggled to hold back. But he kept his mouth shut, knowing that any protest would only feed Hayes's twisted sense of victory. "Thank you, officer," DeAndre said quietly, his tone as neutral as he could manage, hoping to close this horrible chapter and just go home. But Hayes wasn't finished. As he leaned down, lowering his voice so only DeAndre could hear, he spoke with a slow menace. "Just remember, Cooper, I'll be watching. You step out of line, even once, and you'll find yourself right back here, no matter what papers you've got." With that, Hayes stood up, signaling for DeAndre to follow him to the front of the station. As they walked, DeAndre felt the weight of every step, the eyes of officers around him glancing over briefly, some with sympathy, some with disinterest, and others with silent judgment. No one spoke as Hayes unlocked the front door and watched him step out into the night, free at last, but feeling anything but liberated. Outside, the air felt sharp and cold, like a slap to the face, but DeAndre was grateful for it. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The street was empty and quiet, the way it had been before everything had unraveled. He was free to go, but the memory of Hayes's eyes, his words, and the weight of that night stayed with him like an unwanted shadow. As he walked down the street toward his car, DeAndre could already see Vanessa waiting, her figure outlined by the headlights. She'd come without asking, her instinct and love bringing her there despite his attempts to protect her from this ordeal. She stepped out as he approached, her arms immediately wrapping around him, her presence a comfort he'd longed for since the moment this nightmare began. "You're okay," she murmured, her voice soft but laced with worry. "Yeah, I'm okay," he replied, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. As he held her, the weight of everything pressed down harder, the realization settling in that this night would linger, reshaping him in ways he hadn't expected. In the silence of their embrace, DeAndre knew there would be questions and pain, explanations to be shared, and a difficult conversation to have with his son. But tonight, he simply closed his eyes, letting the warmth of Vanessa's hug wash over him, a fragile reminder of peace, of resilience, and of hope, even in a world that often felt relentlessly unforgiving.